Greetings, and thank you for joining us for the TEA 2020 Non-Public Off-Campus Program Overview. This webinar is presented by the Texas Education Agency, Division of Special Education Projects and Strategy. The Individuals with Disabilities Act entitles a student with a disability to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. When a student has educational needs that cannot be met in a public school setting, that student can be educated in a private school or facility referred to as a non-public school. The guiding authority for non-public placements are linked here and provide additional information about day and residential placement requirements. Additional information can be found in TEA's non-public and off-campus program guidance located on the TEA non-public website and linked here for your convenience. In Texas, there are different types of educational programs and settings LEAs contract with for the provision of special education supports and services. An off-campus day program or school can include a county system operating under application of former law, a regional education service center, a non-public day school, or any other public or private entity with which a school district enters into a contract for the provision of special education services. Off-campus day programs provide special education and related services during school hours by someone other than school district personnel and a facility other than an LEA campus. This placement is determined by an ART committee. A non-public residential program or school supports students with disabilities who have been placed for educational and residential purposes via an ART committee determination. A high-level process flow is described here and intended to provide LEAs with a simplified view of the non-public process from placement to funding. When an ART committee places a student in an off-campus day or residential program, the LEA is required to notify TEA of the placement within 30 calendar days. This notification is required regardless of the LEA's intent to access state and/or federal funding. When TEA receives the application, it will be reviewed to ensure state and federal special education requirements are met. If approved, the LEA is eligible for state and federal funds. A side note here. LEAs must meet notification requirements to be eligible for full funding. When an LEA places a student in a day or residential facility, they are required to notify TEA within 30 calendar days of the student's placement. Again, LEAs must notify the agency of day and residential placements in a non-public facility regardless of intent to access funding. Residential Facility Tracker, commonly referred to as RF Tracker, is often confused with a non-public residential placement. Reporting requirements for RF Tracker are reported in TSDS and monitored by the Office of Special Populations and Monitoring, Department of Review and Support. For additional information regarding the differences between non-public residential programs and RF Tracker, refer to the definitions provided in the Residential Program Guidance FAQ in the link below. The RF team can be reached at review and support at tea.texas.gov. This slide reviews the open and close dates for each application. The residential application opens on September 1 and closes on July 1. The day application opens on 9/1 and closes on June 8th. The high-cost fund applications opens on March 1st and closes on May 1. Applications must be submitted within these timeframes. Here we will look at the day placement application and associated funding sources. In addition to being a notification system, the application also serves as a mechanism to apply for state and federal funding. Essentially, the day application in teal will generate SPED allotment funding. If additional funding is needed for a high-cost placement, LEAs can apply for reimbursement through the teal high-cost funds. The day application and high-cost fund application are two separate applications. Completion of a day application will not generate any funding under high-cost funds. Here we will look at a high-level overview of the non-public day placement process and funding information. First, the ART Committee determines the need for a non-public placement. Then the LEA notifies TEA within 30 calendar days of the placement via the TEAL application. Next, TEA reviews the application. If approved, SPED allotment state funding is generated and added to the LEA's allotment disbursement. If funds are not sufficient, the LEA can apply for additional funding through high-cost funds. TEA reviews the high-cost fund application. If approved, federal funds are generated and funds are issued via direct deposit. Here we will look at the residential placement application and associated funding sources. In addition to being a notification system, the residential application also serves as a mechanism to apply for state and federal funding. An application for residential placement can potentially pull from 3 funding sources. State funds are used to pay for educational costs associated with a residential placement. These costs are funded with state funds on the same basis as day school placements. Federal funds can be used to pay for related and residential services via residential grant. To gain access to these funds, LEAs must initiate the residential grant via e-grants. LEAs can apply for additional federal funding for excess costs via the TEAL high-cost fund application. The high-cost fund application is a separate application that is completed. Completion of a residential application alone will not generate any funding under high-cost funds. To review, in order to apply for all potential funding associated with a residential placement, the LEA must 1. Complete the non-public residential application via TEAL. 2. Complete the residential grant application via e-grants. And 3. Complete a high-cost fund application for any excess costs. Here we will look at a high-level overview of the non-public residential placement process and funding information. First, the ART Committee determines the need for a non-public placement. Then the LEA notifies TEA within 30 calendar days of the placement via the TEAL application. Next, TEA reviews the application. If approved, SPED allotment state funding is generated and added to the LEA's allotment disbursement. Federal funding can be generated via the residential grant. This requires the completion of a grant application. Funds are accessed via a NOGA, or Notice of Grant Award. If funds are not sufficient, the LEA can apply for additional funding through a separate high-cost fund application. If approved, additional federal funds are generated and funds are issued via direct deposit. Non-public and off-campus facilities are monitored on a 1 to 3 year cycle. LEAs are required to make 2 on-site visits annually, 1 announced and 1 unannounced. For facilities in a monitoring year, TEA is required to make 2 visits annually, 1 announced and 1 unannounced. Please review the TEA's non-public program guidance for additional information about monitoring and approval requirements. High-cost funds are intended to help offset the financial impact on local education agencies that provide educational services to high-need students with disabilities. A high-need student is defined as those who require educational services which exceed 3 times the average per pupil expenditure, or APPE. LEAs can apply for high-cost funds for students served in-district or off-campus. A reminder, the high-cost fund application is a separate application from the day and residential applications. LEAs frequently use these terms interchangeably, which can cause confusion when applying for funding. See the High Cost Fund State Plan for additional information. When applying for high cost funds, there are several things to keep in mind. If you are applying for high cost funds for a day or residential placement, you must first submit a day or residential application in teal. These applications are highlighted in blue above. Your day or residential application must be reviewed and approved by TEA before you can submit a high cost fund application. Once the day or residential application has been approved, the LEA can go into high cost fund and enter the student's unique ID number, at which time that student's information will port over. LEAs may not manually add high cost fund applications for day or residential students in high cost funds. These applications will port over from your day or residential application. High cost fund eligible costs include those costs associated with providing direct special education and related services. Indirect or consultation services are not eligible for reimbursement. For residential placements, the amount considered for a high cost fund award is limited to a portion of the 25% residential set aside if the set aside exceeds 3 times the state's APPE. For day placements, the amount considered for high cost fund award is limited to a portion of the non-public day school cost if the non-public day school cost exceeds 3 times the state's APPE. Here we will look at a high-level overview of the high cost fund application process and funding information. First, the LEA identifies a high-need student whose educational services exceed 3 times the state's APPE. The LEA submits a high cost fund application for a student served in district or off campus. Reminder here that if the student is day or residential, there is a separate application that must be completed before applying for high cost funds. Next, TEA reviews the application, and if approved, federal funds are generated and issued via direct deposit. If you have additional questions or topics you'd like to see addressed in future resources, please contact us at npdayandres@tea.texas.gov. Additional resources can be found on our web pages. Those are listed below our non-public webpage as well as our high cost fund webpage. Other helpful web pages may include grants or special education funding. Thanks again for joining us for the non-public and off-campus overview. If you are new to this process or have any questions, please don't hesitate to outreach our team at npdayandres@tea.texas.gov. Thank you.